Good evening. On September 1st, 1939, the Germans invaded Poland and the Second World War began. Now, just a few months after that, the Army Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, he had a meeting with Roosevelt. And they knew without a shadow of a doubt, before long, somehow, some way, the United States was going to be in the Second World War. So they decided to take a look at what the Army and the military was like in December of 1939. And what they found was appalling. In December of 1939, the Army had 180,000 men. 45,000 of them were in the Philippines. The Marine Corps in December of 1939 had 18,462 men. The Navy had 125,000. So they knew right away that they needed to get the numbers up. So the plan was for what? The draft. The draft started in the middle of 1940. Now the draft was for 21 to 35-year-olds, not 18, 21 to 35-year-olds. Well, in less than a year, the Army was over 1 million. The Navy was close to 300,000. The Marine Corps was finally up to 300,000. So then General Marshall decided the Army needed some practice maneuvers. They hadn't done a thing since World War I. So he came up with a plan, what they called the Louisiana maneuvers. 3,400 square miles in Louisiana, 400,000 men. It was the largest maneuvers in Army history. Some of the officers that were there for that practice maneuver were George C. Marshall, Mark Clark, George Patton, Omar Bradley, and another general by the name of Dwight D. Eisenhower. The maneuvers were held in August and September of 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor. They were doing maneuvers down in Louisiana. Now they had the maneuvers, and then they took a look at what had gone on. Do you realize the M1 rifle was issued to the United States military in 1936? In 1941, when they did this, they didn't have enough M1s for half the men. Half the men were using 1903 Springfields. They had no ammunition for the M1s. They had some ammunition for the M1, but they had no blank ammunition for them. They couldn't practice shooting at each other. Also, the field equipment they were using was in short supply, and it was all World War I era. It was terrible. Patton was in there, and he charged across Louisiana using World War I tanks. The Sherman tank had just started to be constructed. He didn't have many of those. But they did have one thing that they found worked just fine. C rations. C rations started in the United States in 1938. They made C rations from 1938 to 1958. Now, they must have made a whale of a lot of C rations in 1958. I was in the Marine Corps during the Vietnam era, and some of you were too. What were we eating? C rations from 1958. But that's another whole story. In 1919, a young Army lieutenant was given the task. They wanted to take a convoy of trucks across the United States. They wanted to take them from Washington, D.C. to Sacramento, California. 80 trucks. So this young Army lieutenant, in 1919, can you imagine what the roads were like in 1919? Well, he got it done. 3,251 miles. It took him 62 days. And the average speed was 6 miles an hour. And that young lieutenant was Dwight David Eisenhower. Now, what he learned from 1919 and what he learned from the Louisiana maneuvers became a big factor when he became the Allied Supreme Commander in 1943 and was planning D-Day. Him and another officer come up with an idea for what they called the Red Ball Express. They were going to run supplies from Normandy to the front lines. The Red Ball Express. Basically, it was just a round-the-clock truck movement from Normandy to the front lines. Now, him and the officer, they come up with the rules for the Red Ball Express. All the trucks had to travel in convoys. They had to maintain a 60-yard interval. The trucks could not go over 25 miles an hour, and they couldn't pass. Now, can you imagine a bunch of guys in the Army not wanting to pass another truck? And the last 10 minutes of every hour, they had to stop and rest. Well, the Red Ball Express started in August after D-Day. D-Day was in June. They started the Red Ball Express in August. In less than 2 weeks, all those rules were gone. Because the first thing they did, all those drivers and the mechanics, they took the governors off those trucks. So now those things would run 50 to 60 miles an hour. Can you imagine driving a World War II truck at 60 miles an hour? They didn't worry about convoys, and you think they worried about not passing each other? Come on. Nope. But it run 24/7. They also put 2 men in a truck. They were supposed to stop, change drivers. They didn't do that. Going down the road at 55 miles an hour, one driver would get up from behind the steering wheel, the other one would sit down. They didn't even stop. So the rules were kind of gone. But what they did is unbelievable. They hauled the fuel in what they call jerry cans. Now, a lot of you have seen them. They're about this tall. They got handles on top, slanted in the front. It had a sprout in it. You could put it out or you could put it inside. Patton's loan's allotment for fuel was 300,000 gallons a day. All of a sudden, he was down to getting just 31,000 gallons a day. They were running out of jerry cans. Now, what do you think a tank driver or a Jeep driver did after he got that 5-gallon can and filled it, put it in his truck? What did he do with it? He chucked it. He wasn't going to carry it around, so they were running out of jerry cans. They were also having one other problem. The people were civilians in Europe, knew where the trucks were running. They tried to get on the road and stop the trucks because they thought maybe they'd get something to eat. So they come up with this plan. They put it out there to as much as they could. You bring us jerry cans, we'll give you food. Of course, what was the food? Sea rations. But in less than 2 weeks, the shortage of jerry cans was over. And Patton was back to over 250,000 gallons a day. Another big problem they were having in the Red Ball Express, they were using 1,000 tires a day. You see, the roads were covered with sea ration cans, and they were shredding the tires of the trucks. But there wasn't much they could do about it. At the height of World War II and the height of when they were using the Red Ball Express, every minute of every day, 5,000 trucks were on the road at any given moment, 24 hours a day. What they did was they had a road, the North Road was to the front, one way to the front. They had another road to the south, it was back to the Normandy. No one was to use that but the Red Ball Express. One way there, one way back. Now, it began to be a problem because the farther and farther away they got from the front kept moving. 200 miles, 300 miles. These drivers were driving that 2 or 3 times a day. They got so fatigued that pretty soon they were pulling off the side of the road, sabotaging their trucks just so they could rest. And then it became a huge problem. They were going so far, they got to 400 miles. The trucks were burning more fuel just to get to the front than they were given to the front. It became a major, major problem. But just about that time, the Allies took the port of Antwerp, and the problems were over. Much shorter distance, and the Red Ball Express kind of faded away. Now you all know that D-Day was on June the 6th, 1944. The war ended in Europe on May the 8th, 1945. 11 months. From D-Day to the end was just 11 months. And a big thanks goes to what? The Red Ball Express. They did a tremendous job. 75% of the drivers of the Red Ball Express were African Americans, and they did one fantastic job. I have one more little note. The 34th President of the United States, he came up with the idea for the interstates. He figured it out what we should do. He figured out how to pay it for it. They started in 1956. It took 35 years to build the interstate system that we use today. And what name of that president? Dwight D. Eisenhower. Thank you, sir.
Good job.